Okay, perfect. So, hello and welcome everyone to the research room. Um, so the research room is produced by MAPS Canada, a volunteer-run, non-profit charitable organization committed to expanding access to safe and legal psychedelics through research, education, and advocacy. The MAPS Canada Research Room is a monthly online program that highlights cutting-edge Canadian research and researchers from a range of disciplines within the growing field of psychedelic studies. The research room offers a platform for researchers to actively engage with the audience and their current work. So thank you for joining us today for this session. This month is a Cannabis month at MAPS Canada, and we're thrilled to have Jordy Cates with us to present her research. So Jordy is a member of Okanagan Indian Band and the first year PhD student in clinical psychology program at UBC Okanagan, UBCO. She started working with Dr. Zach Walsh in 2019 through the Indigenous Research Mentorship Program at UBCO. She completed her bachelor's in psychology with a minor in biology in 2021 and her master's in clinical psychology in 2024. Her master's project focused on indigenous perspectives of cannabis use. Her doctoral research project is focused on the microdosing of psychedelics. More broadly, her research focuses on substance use, indigenous research methods, drug checking, and harm reduction. She's a co-founder of the UBCO ISIS, yes, I tried it. Group which aims to provide networking opportunities and foster community for Indigenous STEM students. So welcome, Jordy Cates, and I'm gonna stop sharing my presentation and hand you over the slides.
Thank you. Thank you. Can you guys see my slides? I'm gonna think yes, because I have no complaints. So I'm gonna be chatting with you all today about my thesis work. So this is a larger project, but my thesis, I picked a combination of a participant's quote to kind of create the title. So it's a plant, and that's why I think it's a medicine, Indigenous Perspectives of Cannabis Use on Turtle Island. And so today I will go through a little bit of an agenda. So I'll introduce myself. I'll share the approach that we use for this study. I'll give you some background as to why we even wanted to do this. Then we'll dive deeply into the project, look at the findings, and then talk about some takeaways. Um, Ideally, I'd love to be able to have more of a conversation base, but I'll talk at you for a little bit, and then hopefully we can have a bit of a discussion. So lovely introduction. Thank you so much. So my work has predominantly focused on Indigenous cannabis use. So I've been doing it for a couple of years, all at UBCO with my supervisor, Dr. Zach Welsh. And when I was kind of researching this, I came across Sean Wilson's book called Research is Ceremony, and that heavily influenced how I decided to approach my thesis and this project. And I really like this quote. Indigenous peoples in Canada recognize that it is important for storytellers to impart their own life and experiences into the telling. They also recognize that listeners will filter the story being told through their own experiences and thus adapt the information to make it relevant and specific to their life. When listeners know where the storyteller is coming from and how the story fits into the storyteller's life, it makes the absorption of that knowledge that much easier. So you've had a brief introduction of me, but cannabis is a big part of what I research. But I kind of operate through the harm reduction lens. So drug checking is also a big part of what I do, and what I'm involved in, as well as looking at psychedelics for therapeutic uses, which is what my dissertation, my doctoral work will focus on. But today, I want to share about this project that we undertook. So I started working on this in 2019. And I was just doing like a little brief lit review at the time, and that led to a bigger grant, which allowed us to conduct this study. So We had an Indigenous-led team, Indigenous researchers, research assistants, and Indigenous community partners. So we called it the Cutie Project because it stood for Cannabis Use on Turtle Island. And it was co-developed with our Indigenous partners. So we had two phases, which was not intentional. We originally set out to work with Woodland Cree First Nation and Indigenous Bloom Corporation. So it was like a bunch of chiefs that kind of came together and created Indigenous Bloom, and there was several dispensaries. And so I'll get into the nitty-gritty of that later, but that was our first partner. And then Zagame and Anishinaabe had reached out to us later on and was really interested by what we were doing and wanted to kind of explore cannabis use within their community. So we kind of have like a large like urban sample from Woodland Cree and Indigenous Bloom, and then we have more of a community-based sample from Zagame Anishinaabe. So part of our approach was built, there was no like scaffolding for this when we started. So I resonated with Sean Wilson's book, Researcher's Ceremony, and then this approach of two-eyed seeing which was first described in 2004 by Mi'kmaq elders Albert and Miranda Marshall. So they say that two-eyed seeing is the gift of multiple perspectives. So it's learning to see from one eye with the strengths of Indigenous knowledges and ways of knowing, and then from the other eye with the strengths of Western knowledges and ways of knowing. And then you use both of these for kind of the benefit of all. And I think that that really resonated with me as an Indigenous person who was raised off reserve, who has been trained in a colonial institution. And this really allowed me to feel like all of my perspectives were able to be captured. And I think it's important for the researchers to be able to speak to their experiences and how that might influence the work. And this kind of framework of two-eyed seeing has six kind of key pieces to it. Um, so the first is authentic relationships between the researchers and the Indigenous community. Um, Both the researchers and the participants are benefiting from the research process. The research team is responsible for the well-being of all of those who are involved. There's Indigenous community involvement within the research project or process. There's recognition and prior guidance from the local Indigenous customs. And the Western researchers really take the role of the follower, the listener, and the learner. And I think that these are really important guiding factors for those who are choosing to engage in community-based research with Indigenous communities. And I think all of our whole project, I could go into detail as to how these were all carried out, but you'll just have to trust me or read my giant thesis to know how these are all kind of accounted for. But these are really the guiding principles that we carried with us. So for some background to kind of get us all on the same page as to why we wanted to explore Indigenous perspectives as cannabis use. So when I started looking into the literature on cannabis use among Indigenous peoples, I first of all didn't really see my own experience as an Indigenous person or as a cannabis user captured within the literature. Typically, what was happening is that research was non-collaborative. It was predominantly done on Indigenous peoples and not by or for Indigenous peoples. And a quote by the TCPS2 says, research involving Indigenous peoples in Canada has not been defined and carried out primarily, or sorry, has been defined and carried out primarily by non-Indigenous researchers. And the approaches used have generally not reflected Indigenous worldviews, and the research has not necessarily benefited Indigenous peoples or communities. And the second issue is that most research has employed deficit-based methods, which means that they're focused on identifying issues, and that's typically by comparing non-Indigenous peoples to Indigenous peoples. And the third issue is that the research predominantly focused on how frequently someone was using cannabis and typically ignored the context within which the person uses cannabis or even explored what motivates them to use it. And so we typically see this like problematic cannabis use, or when Indigenous peoples are compared to non, it's that there's higher rates and that is riskier behavior. But if we're not asking why there's like why people are using cannabis, we're missing a key piece of the picture. And there's a quote, but I can't remember who it's by. And he describes that comparing non-Indigenous to Indigenous peoples is like comparing apples to oranges. So a non-Indigenous person is never going to be an Indigenous person and vice versa, right? So that comparison doesn't really tell us a whole lot. Oops. Um, and so when we look at just broadly research that has examined cannabis use motivations among the general population, cannabis use can typically be split up into therapeutic use, recreational, and then problematic. And we know from research on non-Indigenous peoples that people are using cannabis for a variety of reasons. And this is from a paper, Luang et al. In 2022. We see that people are using it for pain, for sleep, anxiety, depression, lack of appetite, PTSD, managing the use of other substances. So investigating how or if the therapeutic application of cannabis differs among Indigenous people can provide really valuable insight into the optimization of cannabis-based treatments for various symptoms and conditions. But this is really important when we consider barriers that Indigenous peoples face when accessing healthcare. So what are these barriers? In 2020, there was a report, the In Plain Sight report, that looked at examining the experiences of Indigenous peoples within the BC healthcare system. And this report highlighted that stereotyping and discrimination of Indigenous peoples reaches every corner of the healthcare system. So for example, 84% of people, of Indigenous respondents, endorse experiencing discrimination related to at least one of the following: ancestry, income level, education, sexual orientation, substance use, skin color, appearance. And this discrimination results in a lack of trust and avoidance of the healthcare system. And so this tells us that stigma and discrimination is not something that should just be overlooked because there's been a change in cannabis regulation here in Canada. I think an important concept here is that of double stigma or multiple discrimination, whereby an Indigenous person simultaneously experiences discrimination related to their Indigenous identity, but also their cannabis use or their substance use more broadly. And we can see that these stereotypes have not been dismantled in the minds of everyone, and then thus create the barriers that Indigenous peoples face. But it's interesting because there's traditional use of plant medicines by Indigenous peoples. And with the recent legalization, I guess it's not so recent anymore, but of cannabis, there may be an emerging acceptance or perhaps an under-recognized acceptance of cannabis as a therapeutic tool due to these kind of presented issues in the previous cannabis research. And so since cannabis can be accessed outside of the formal healthcare system, this may present an opportunity for increased healthcare sovereignty and autonomy among Indigenous peoples while these systems all work towards reconciliation. So with that all in mind, let's take a look at the current project. So we had two main aims with this project. We wanted to share our methods and process because, like I said, there wasn't a framework, a model, anything to kind of look back on to help guide us here. So we really wanted to be able to share that. And that's why, I thought about the purposeful presenting of myself. And that really is a part of this project. And that's why I maintained it within this presentation. And the second aim was to just give rise to Indigenous voices and perspectives. So how did we do this? Well, like I said, we had two phases. So in both phases, we carried the fundamentals of OCAP, which are the principles of ownership, control, access, and possession, forward to inform this research. And we also created data sharing agreements to ensure that the community, like our community partners, and us as UBC, like who is representing UBCO, had a good kind of guiding framework for who had ownership, control, access, and possession of the data. And we also, in the phase 1, we co-created semi-structured interviews based on some of our previous work. And these were all kind of modified with our community partners to ensure that we were asking the questions that they wanted to know the answers to. So at the final version, it started with open-ended questions because we really wanted to have kind of a conversation at the very beginning. It can be quite daunting to just hop into a Zoom interview and just be like bombarded with questions. So we really wanted to allow for that open conversation, and we chose questions to be that we chose the open-ended questions to be able to complement some of our close-ended or like quantitative questions. And that kind of, I'll get into that in when I talk about how I analyze the data. Um, but yeah, we wanted to create an interview script that facilitated conversation and allowed for like flexibility to ensure that we were capturing the perspectives of each person. And we also had to kind of pivot for recruitment, which is an obstacle I'll talk about in the next slide. But in phase 1, what we did is we predominantly recruited through the Indigenous Bloom dispensaries, and that was between December of 2021 and August of 2022. And then in phase 2, respondents were mainly recruited through a community Facebook page. So Zagame Anishinaabe had put that the study was happening, and then participants could reach out to us via email or phone, and then we would set up a Zoom kind of interview. And then the interviews typically lasted about an hour and a half, depending on how good the conversation was. And everyone was awarded or had a $50 honorarium. But the eligibility, as you can see here, what for phase 1 and initially phase 2 was self-identification as Indigenous, older than 18, and that they use cannabis. In phase 2, we had to pivot a little bit, but I'll talk about that in a second. Um, and then we also, in each of the phases, we chatted with the community partners to figure out what the best way to disseminate the findings were. And we offered an opportunity for every research participant to reach back out after we had sent them like a couple page preliminary findings, so that if things weren't captured correctly, they had an opportunity to kind of continue to share their perspectives. Um, and so, like I said, we did run into a couple of obstacles along the way. The first one was funny enough with our ethics board. So when we submitted initially, the Behavioral Research Ethics Board, we kind of had an unexpected level of concern about our team's ethical competency in upholding OCAP principles, which ended up delaying the onset of our project. But nevertheless, the caution from the ethics board, who did not have Indigenous representation, um, it like they were questioning our capacity as an Indigenous-led research team. And I think that this kind of highlights the complexity of conducting research within like a colonial framework. So Grenz in 2023 suggested that there should be kind of like a research ethics board that's specifically for Indigenous scholars who are conducting research alongside Indigenous communities to help mitigate the delay and perhaps more unexpected levels of concern about Indigenous people's ability to partner with other Indigenous communities. Another barrier we ran into was infrastructure. So typically, Indigenous community timelines do not line up with institutional timelines. So we really made sure to let the institution know that we're operating on the community's timelines and no one else's. And with that, we were also working with a rural community, with two rural communities. So in the first phase, we tried to set up like the health center so that there was iPads and community members could come in and do their interviews and they could have access to internet in a confidential space. But there was like weather difficulties and changing of roles. And so unfortunately, we weren't able to set up this space in the health center, which is why we predominantly recruited through Indigenous Bloom dispensaries and not specifically Woodland Cree. Um, so that's just like I chose to share these obstacles because these are things that we ran into, and I think other researchers could run into similar things. So I think it's important to know that there's support out there and that there is a project out there that has run into them and has found ways to kind of mitigate them. The third thing that we ran into was actually some tension with the settler cannabis industry. So I'll put up, these are these are screenshots from a Castanet article. Castanet is like the Okanagan's kind of news place. So they had the title is UBCO study on Indigenous cannabis use rattles legal retailers. And I mean, even that just makes that dichotomy of Indigenous cannabis use or dispensaries not being legal. And then there's this, settler industry that is inherently legal. And they said that we were supporting a criminal organization that they wanted us to terminate our agreements and that we remove any research findings. They also said that they were going to email or like send all the BC MLAs. And I mean, they actually like went through with this surprisingly, and I don't know, the courts ended up overturning it or something. I tried not to get lost in these weeds. But these were real obstacles and real things that we came across. And the last one in the phase two, what I was kind of alluding to with the recruitment is that we ran into this. I have it here, pretendian problem, but I don't think that that captures the extent of it. A better term for it is Indigenous identity fraud. And so typically we've seen this maybe in the news for career advancement, but I've never come across it in terms of participants. So originally we had people who, like I said, there was the Facebook posting and people could come and join from there. And what was happening is that we were getting people who were not from the community. And so we had kind of had to pivot on our eligibility criteria. And so after discussion with Zagme and Anishinaabe, we had chose to include a screening question which asked for the first and last three digits of a respondent's status card number to ensure band membership. Now, this is definitely a larger discussion because status is inherent, like the Indian Act is inherently like a colonial tool. However, Zagame and Anishinaabe really wanted to ensure that it was their members, and this was the way that we came up with without collecting full identifying information. So I look forward to any kind of questions or discussions around that. But anyway, um, in terms of analysis, like I had said, when we created the interview script, we wanted to make sure that we were able to have conversations. So what we did is we used data complementarity. So we used closed-ended questions and open-ended questions to kind of complement one another and to kind of build off of one another. And I just didn't feel like there was any Western methods that were able to kind of capture what I wanted to do. So this is kind of what we came up with, and this allowed us to kind of combine Western methods with storytelling and the relational aspects of Indigenous methods. And we kind of had to create our own path because, again, there wasn't really anything that was out there. So for findings, I know that people typically will have like a chart that shows all the demographics, and I do have some of that, but I created this a while ago to show the little green leaves, the little green cannabis leaves are trying to capture where all the participants are from. So we have quite a variety. Um, and then the two kind of orangey ones are where our community partners are based. Um, and then so in total, we had 69 participants. We had 61 from phase one and 8 from phase two. The majority indicated that they were regular cannabis users, so that's 64 of them. And most were female and under the age of 40. Most respondents identified as status holding members of First Nations communities, with the remaining respondents identifying as non-status First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. We had a number of people who reported speaking Indigenous languages at home, which I think is really cool, and something that I think is important to highlight. So now let's take a look at some of our open-ended questions regarding perceptions of cannabis use. So we asked people, do you think cannabis can be a medicine? And 98% of them thought that it could be. And so I've included kind of quotes under some of these slides to capture what people have said. So someone said, most definitely it's a medicine because it's a plant. It comes to us from the creator, you know? So every plant does something good. Even stinging nettle makes tea that heals us. And another person said, I absolutely think it's a medicine. It's an internal sage. It helps with cancer, mental illness, and physical pain. And then we asked people, have you always felt this way about cannabis? And 60% of people have felt however they felt, whether it be that cannabis wasn't a medicine or that it is. 60% of them said that they felt that cannabis could always be a medicine. And someone said, I've grown up with a lot of family members with cancer and they always turn to cannabis. I've never disagreed with it. Well, I've disagreed with being outlawed. And another person said, no, they definitely have not always felt this way. They said, I'm Indigenous. When it was illegal, it's like, yeah, no, not a chance, man. When weed was illegal, being brown and smoking weed in the city doesn't go well. And then we asked people, well, can cannabis be both a medicine and used for pleasure? And 95% of people felt that cannabis could be both a medicine and used for pleasure. So this person says, I feel it can be both because it's something I utilize in my capacity. I utilize the medicinal part to get me through the tough phases of my life and just to help me on a daily basis. And then I use it recreationally. For example, we have THC gummies. Those are used on a Friday night by the pool when we're going out to the lake and we're going camping out there. Um, we'll get into some more open-ended stuff, but for just to look at some of the motivations that people had. So, a minority of people endorse solely therapeutic or solely recreational motivations, while the majority of our regular cannabis users indicated that they use cannabis for both therapeutic and recreational reasons. And then when we take a deeper dive into these motivations, we find that on average, people had 8 different motivations for using cannabis in the last 6 months. Um, of those respondents who reported a main therapeutic motivation within the last 6 months, the majority reported using cannabis daily or multiple times a day for their motivation. The majority considered cannabis to be very helpful or extremely helpful for their main motivation. 65% reported 80 to 100% relief from using cannabis for their main motivation. And while all this being said, only 53% reported that they could always afford to buy enough cannabis to relieve their symptoms for their main motivation. So, what were the main motivations? So, in the last 6 months, people talked about stress, anxiety, pain, and sleep. These were the main ones. But again, ensuring that we're keeping in mind people typically had reported 8 in the last 6 months. We also asked our respondents if they ever used cannabis to stop or reduce the use of other substances, and 52% said yes, they did. And someone shared, when I was a crack addict and I was in my past, when I was drinking was when I wanted to go buy crack. But when I smoked a joint, I didn't want to go buy crack. And so when we asked people about what substances they were using cannabis as a substitute for, the number one was alcohol, followed by cocaine, opioids, crack, meth, and cigarettes. There was a number of other ones, but I couldn't list them all. So you should just go read the thesis. When we asked how people were using it in the last 6 months, um, smoking flower was the main one, followed by edibles, vaping, topicals, oral preparations like tinctures, oils, capsules, and then the least amount was concentrates like dabs, shatter, or butter. And then we also asked people, where are you getting your cannabis in the last where are you getting it in the last 6 months, most often in preferred. And so if we look at the very bottom of this slide, the most commonly reported source of cannabis in the last 6 months was an Indigenous cannabis dispensary. The source frequented most often was an Indigenous cannabis dispensary, and the preferred source was also an Indigenous cannabis dispensary. Now, I know you might be thinking, well, you recruited predominantly through an Indigenous cannabis dispensary, and that is very fair. But I do think that there is some perspectives as to why, which we did look at. So we asked people, does the availability or access of cannabis shape how you feel about it as a medicine? And it was kind of split. So 52% felt that the source had no impact on cannabis as a medicine. And this person says it does not, absolutely not. Cannabis has been available for hundreds of years, and these stores are just opening. They're the ones that need to do the research. Whereas 44% did think it had an impact. And they said, it's certainly nice to go to a dispensary, but I don't trust the government either, as far as I can throw them. But the sense that it's really you know what you're getting. You can ask for certain things and it's safe. There's nobody with a bunch of fentanyl next to your weed. So it is interesting where we see this preference for an Indigenous cannabis dispensary. But it's pretty split as to whether or not people think that where they buy it determines whether or not it can be used as a medicine. We also looked at stigma and barriers to healthcare, like I talked about in the background. And we found that 39% wanted to talk to their doctor about cannabis, but hadn't. And 46 had previously experienced discrimination from their doctors because of bringing up the topic of cannabis. And then we also asked people open-ended, do you think cannabis is stigmatized as a potential medicine? And 69% of people felt that cannabis was stigmatized. And this person says, yeah, for sure. I felt that my whole life. How do you explain to someone, look, if I don't smoke this joint, maybe I'll be suicidal today. But if you're sitting on a park bench and pull out your prescription medication and shove 3 of those down your mouth, you're an okay guy. Another person said, I think people just think pot smokers are brain dead. They don't realize that they're probably masking, smoking or using it for some reason. It's a gateway drug. That's what they try and say, but it's not. Trauma is the gateway. Everything else is just what people do to try and close the gate. They almost look at pot as different than just having a drink. Why is that acceptable, but smoking isn't? So, with all that, and this is kind of like the brief overview of the bigger study, I think that there are some kind of key takeaways from this discussion. Number one, I think that this is a stepping stone for future researchers, for current researchers. Like I said, when we started this work, we didn't have a model for how to do this. And if I would have come across a study like this, it might have provided a lot of insight and helped guide this project further. So I don't think it's just about the results here. I think the results are amazing. I think a lot of the people who shared their experience um, really enjoyed having a place to talk about their cannabis use because they felt like they haven't been able to. Um, but I think it's more too about the translation of the journey and how we approach this project. So our hope is that we can provide like the scaffolding of a model or a methodology, and at the very least that this is a stepping stone for other Indigenous communities, for researchers, when considering their project. So this is definitely not a one size fits all by any means. Um, but I think this can show how you can use two-eyed seeing and kind of apply it in different ways. And that perspective or approach might not be appropriate for every community. Sometimes communities have their own approach, and so it's important to develop a really, really strong relationship and allow for that time for the rapport to build to ensure that the methods and the process and every step of the way is kind of guided by that Indigenous community's customs, and that everyone feels like they have a seat at the table. I think another thing that was difficult is when we started this work, it was during COVID and we weren't able to go to the community. I think that could be an important piece, but again, I think any assumptions is probably where you're going to go wrong. I think it's always okay to ask questions to ensure that the research team is supporting the community's goals. Um, so overarchingly, it's not a one size fits all. Be curious, but I hope that other researchers can look at this and either take something from it, make it better, or at least, find support in the research team that we have to help guide their project. Um, and with a good relationship, you can end up doing multiple projects with the community. We're continuing to work with Zegme and Anishinaabe. They're looking, this was originally just supposed to be kind of a pilot to see what their community members were using cannabis for, what they thought about it. And now they want to move forward with looking more at cannabis to see if they can get coverage for people who use it medically, because that is not always the case with different Indigenous health authorities. It differs province to province. Um, Another takeaway is that cannabis is a medicine. That's what we heard from our participants. That's what we've seen in non-Indigenous research. So it might suggest that there are more similarities than differences in the sense that cannabis is seen as a therapeutic tool both by Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. And this is something that we haven't been able to capture in the previous research because of the ways that we've approached research. Um, there's multiple motivations for cannabis, right? So when we just kind of split it up between therapeutic, recreational, and problematic, we forget about the people that are using it therapeutically and recreationally. And problematic assessing problematic cannabis use is a whole other can of worms that I do love to talk about, but won't today. But I think it's really important to um, assume that there's heterogeneity within some of these categories and that we can't just say, oh, this person uses it therapeutically and this person uses it recreationally, because someone might use it therapeutically at 9 in the morning and then might use it recreationally at 4 o'clock, So it's important that the ways that we're approaching this type of research accounts for that and allows space for people to share um, their different motivations. And then the other two here, Indigenous dispensaries and discrimination. So Indigenous dispensaries, as we've seen from some of the obstacles that we ran into, are definitely a point of contention. There's some legal policies that have to change in order for Indigenous communities to have the same kind of licensing structure as non-Indigenous dispensaries do. But I think there's an economic opportunity here aside and health, um, sovereignty in general here for Indigenous communities to be able to have access and control over their own medicines. Um, and I think this is something for communities to think about, something for policymakers to think about. Um, and yeah, there's for this discrimination piece, it's, despite how many people think that cannabis is a medicine, we still saw within our respondents that they expressed discomfort and uncertainty about discussing cannabis with their doctor. But this doesn't really come to a huge surprise because of the In Plain Sight report that we saw that discrimination is in every corner of the BC healthcare system. And I don't think that it's isolated to BC. I think we see this, I think it's a pervasive issue. But, you know, in the name of reconciliation, it's in the best interest of everyone that healthcare providers, policymakers read documents like this and the In Plain Sight report to reflect on and reduce their biases and subsequently the barriers that Indigenous peoples face when accessing healthcare. Um, and yeah, I think I've kind of roundabout alluded to these policy implications, but I think the last point is just um, cannabis can be a therapeutic tool, and it may be a different approach, but perhaps in the name of harm reduction, providers might be able to shift their focus to cannabis as a replacement or as a substitute for other substances, to increase the number of options that people have when they're seeking support um, for problematic substance use. But with that, thank you so much for listening. Um, and if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to chat.
Thank you so much, Jordy. So that was a great talk. So while we're waiting for the questions to come in, I don't see you can ask questions in the chat or just raise your hand and just ask your question. So oh yeah, already have questions. Okay, so go ahead.
Well, I guess I'm on. Jordy, very nice. Nice to see
Oh,
you.
nice to see you too.
Sure. I was not surprised at all that the reasons that people were citing for using cannabis medically were very much what we see in all the surveys. What
Hmm.
I'd be really interested in hearing was there any allusion to spiritual use in keeping with Indigenous practice?
Yeah, great question. There was some um, traditional use that people had talked about. It was infrequent, I would say. And I think like I said, it was we when I showed that big map, we had people from all over from different communities. There was, but it wasn't like a major topic. It was typically more like my, my mom used it, my grandma used it, my aunt used it. There wasn't necessarily a major kind of recognition of spiritual or traditional use. But I would admit that I don't think our questions necessarily prompted spiritual use. And I think when I reflect on my experience in the interviews, people really, um, the prompts really guided the discussion. So I think that that would be something to explore. Um, but yeah, I do remember people talking about that in terms of like connecting with themselves. So it would be more mindfulness. Um, but yeah, does that answer your question?
Sure. Just a quick follow-up. Did anyone mention it in relation to vision quests or things of this sort?
Um, that's a good question. Not that I can remember. I would honestly have to look back at my thesis to see if the details. Um, if there was, it would be like like a one, two, three maybe people that really dove deep into that, but it wouldn't have been a main finding from it.
Okay, thanks.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Okay, so oh, there's another question I see. So okay, while we're waiting for another question, maybe I'll ask. I have a question too. You said about that there is more similarities than differences between indigenous and non-indigenous cannabis use.
Mhm.
So, and it just threw me back to the last month conference because we had Philip Lucas who was doing a survey, like a big survey in 2023, and he was presenting his results. So I was wondering what if you could talk a little bit about more about similarities and differences, if there is any, about in indigenous and non-indigenous cannabis use.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So when I say that, I say it kind of in the context that previous research has typically, like within non-Indigenous research, we've seen it go from problematic to kind of looking more medically. And then we kind of see the distinction between like medical use and recreational use. And when we look at that literature in non-Indigenous populations, in the therapeutic use or medical use, we see that it's used for a variety of things like stress, sleep, pain, yada, yada, yada. And when I say that there's perhaps more similarities, what I mean is in that therapeutic use, we're still seeing those same kinds of therapeutic motivations. And then if we were to jump back to what previous research has typically looked at Indigenous peoples, is that it's typically just blanketed as problematic. So I more mean this in the way that these can be looked at perhaps as novel findings because previous research hasn't given the opportunity for people to say that they're using it therapeutically. It's always been blanketed that it is problematic and that there's something that needs to change. And that we've kind of seen that shift with medical cannabis within non-Indigenous populations, but haven't seen that presented in the literature for Indigenous peoples. Um, I think in terms of a difference, um, there might be more of that that double discrimination, double stigma piece that people might talk about from as an Indigenous person, because they're already met with perhaps discrimination because of their Indigenous identity, but then on top of that, substance use, which may present as a difference when looking at non-Indigenous cannabis use. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, yeah, thank you so much. I see we have another question actually, so
Mhm.
I'm gonna mute. Um, and also, if you could stop sharing your
Absolutely. Yes, thank you.
oh, go ahead for the question.
Hello, I'm Naomi Nicholson, and I am an Indigenous person. I'm born into the Ahousaht First Nation, and I'm married into, because of the Indian Act, the Sishot First Nation.
Mhm.
I want to thank you for I have so much I want to say in a quick amount of time. For those who don't get it, we are apples and oranges, but we're
Mhm.
not even that same fruit because I
Mhm.
explain Indigenous like an umbrella, and
Mhm.
each umbrella has things that the spokes that make up the umbrella, and
Mhm.
those are the nations that make up the umbrella. So
Mhm.
I am New Channels as a whole, but I'm
Mhm.
from Sishot First Nation. And
Mhm.
the way Sishot First Nation and Ahousaht First Nation talk and do things, from cleansing to singing and
Mhm.
even language, is a
Mhm.
different umbrella, essentially, even though we're part of the same umbrella being New Channel. So
Absolutely.
I want to preface that because people don't understand that just because you're Indian, Indigenous,
Mhm.
Indian can be offensive, but I'm not offended by that term,
Mhm.
but it is offensive to
Mhm.
the different generation because that's what was derogatory towards them. I'd much rather be an Indian than Aboriginal, Indigenous, First Nation, First People. Like
Mhm.
I've had so much change
Mhm.
without my will.
Mhm.
And as far as the pretend Indian goes, oh my God, any researcher who's listening, anybody who gives out money,
Mhm.
you are part of the problem
Mhm.
once you're
Mhm.
aware that you need to ask for a status card, because there are rules to membership and
Mhm.
anybody can self-identify as anything. And just don't
Absolutely.
get me started, but
I
I'm
know.
glad you learned a lesson and that you recognize that you need to say that,
Absolutely.
because I get faced with that too. People think because I'm Indigenous, I can't do it, but I can do it better than most white people. And if that
Mhm.
offends you, then you got to check a level of the privilege that you have. And I don't mean that in a mean way. As far as the doctor goes, I use cannabis. I have a medical cannabis license. I started
Mhm.
microdosing mushrooms, and oh my God, that's changed my life. I am very grateful that the First Nations Health Authority
Mhm.
has the Doctor of the Day program where Dr. Karen Kilpatrick knows all about my nervous system problems. And that's one of the things in the research I want to do to get clarity is that we're not managing addiction. We're managing our nervous system, and our nervous systems are far more delicate and stimulated due to the cards that we've had given to us. So I just sort of want to add that to it. And I'm very lucky that this particular doctor, supports me, because I could tell you I would not be here if it wasn't for her. I absolutely would have taken my life, and it happens a lot because we don't get the help. The medical system will pay thousands of dollars a year for meds for me, but they won't pay $4,000. It cost me about $4,000 to manage my cannabis through a medical thing, which yes, it's tested. And while we have Indigenous dispensaries, because the provincial rules don't apply the same as federal rules do, because they wanted to give us an opportunity of economic development and control over our health sovereignty, the problem with dispensaries is where they get it from. I know for a fact that the dispensary owner gets and sells moldy weed. I know how to look at weed. So there are problems with Indigenous dispensaries, but when you can see it, touch it, taste it, or smell it, people will prefer that over government stores. So
Absolutely.
I'm absolutely going to follow up with you. I don't want to take any more time, but I wanted to really share these points because if you're not Indigenous, you just don't understand the layers, but you have this perception that I get everything being an Indigenous person. And believe me, the small wins that I get, like you coming here for a full spectrum cannabis massage. And by the way, I do cannabis massage, and being able to do other things does not outweigh the fact that I face so much discrimination. I don't even tell people I'm Indigenous, nor do I even tell people my motel is Indigenous, because I get treated so bad. So thank you so much. The discrimination is real. I have your information, and I absolutely want to follow up with you. And just thank you so much.
Thank you so much for sharing, and I look forward to hearing from you.
Okay, so do we have any more questions? Yeah, go ahead, Terry.
Oh, I think she's just clapping.
Oh, okay. Okay, so if there is no any more questions, I'm just gonna share really quick before we wrap it up. Do you see my slides? Do you see my slides?
Yep.
Jordy? Okay. Yeah. So, thank you so much, Jordy, again for coming today and presenting your research to us. So now our next session is on May 8th with Dr. Human Farzin. And if you want join our mailing list, get updates, you can visit our webpage and you will see the recording of this presentation as well on our webpage. And if you want to see others as well, you can find them there. So please consider making a donation. And again, thank you so much for coming, everybody. And so see you next month.
Thank you so much.
Bye bye.
Bye.